hey, can we travel back in time just a little bit shortly? While I wouldn't wish January of 2021 on any of us, I would like us to remember the moment of Bridgerton season 1 just having dropped and it becoming this almost surprise hit and, dare I say, phenomenon. And in wake of that, romance readers, including myself, being incredibly optimistic about the potential for new adaptations of popular romance series to the screen. And now, fast forward to now, where we've seen those dreams kind of fizzle out, and yet I believe we are still seeing Bridgerton's effect on the things being produced, and yet it feels like it is somehow judging the original source material in a way that I believe the success of Bridgerton in the first place is because the production isn't judging that source material. So I want to sit down and have a kind of casual conversation about this today. If you've not been here before, welcome. My name is Melody. I generally talk about books, but if you have been here for a second, you know I also talk pretty extensively about Bridgerton in particular, but book-to-screen adaptations as they interest me, sometimes book-to-stage adaptations as well, because I do have a background as a theatrical dramaturg and with that literary management, and so I'm very interested in the construction of these stories and the translation from the book to the screen or the stage and what that process looks like and the choices that are being made. Would also love to have you stick around because as of this posting and my kind of grand ambitions, we're about to dive into some videos and book discussions regarding The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton, which has recently been released as an Apple Plus TV show and is part of the whole impetus of this kind of thought experiment for me. Because while I think back to 2021 and all of those kind of optimistic threads about what romance series we'd love to see put on screen in wake of Bridgerton's success, the kind of optimistic dreams of it all, instead I feel like we have been seeing more classics greenlit with a kind of Bridgerton flavor to them. And I find this really interesting, and I want to be clear out of the gate that I read both romance and classics. I enjoy both romance and classics. This is not me pitting them against each other, but rather just kind of opening this conversation and looking at what I'm seeing. Because to me, what I'm seeing are projects like the most recent Persuasion, which we've talked about and we'll dive a little bit more into here, and the new Buccaneers being greenlit and produced. And they're taking on these more modern conceits. I don't think the conceptions of these productions are copying Bridgerton and Bridgerton's success. I think it's making it easier for these conceits to get picked up in the first place. Especially, I'm about a third of the way through the Buccaneers, and the tone of that book in particular really seems to gel with the trailer I've seen for that show. I'm very interested in what that's going to be tonally, but it also feels very much primed for Bridgerton audiences, and a lot of the reviews that I peeked at, because I don't want spoilers ultimately, have also framed the conversation in a similar way, and in a way that I'm interpreting, and maybe this is my own bias coming to the table as well, that these projects are being given a little bit more weight and taken more seriously, or the classics are being picked up because they have this weight behind them. In the same vein, we talked about this when Queen Charlotte came out earlier this year, that some of the reviews of that, which I loved the show, but some of the reviews were really frustrating for me because it was kind of juxtaposing it, putting it up against Bridgerton proper, and saying that it was somehow better or more serious because of the way in particular the ending was handled and this idea of the happily ever after. And I have been on record many times before saying the happily ever after in and of itself is not a reductive thing to my experience, that it allows us to explore a lot of really deep and weighty things, and we've seen that in Bridgerton itself even, with this kind of promise of the happily ever after, and also the maneuvering of the happily ever after also takes a lot of skill to kind of build to that third act breakup, to make it believable, to make the characters believable, and then to kind of turn it around and give us that really satisfying moment is hard. And so I was seeing reviews of Queen Charlotte that was treating that as more complex in a way that felt judgmental to the original series. And I think we're still seeing this bias, whether conscious or unconscious, in what is being produced. Bridgerton has been around since the end of 2020 now. We're not going to even get into the waits we've had between seasons, because I am just as frustrated as all of you, but it is an undeniable success, and it feels like we're trying to see the replication of that success without really looking at what made it a success to begin with. Because as we mentioned many a time before in relation to romance, particularly historical romance, while it may have a historical setting, romance is for the time it is written in. Now granted, Bridgerton originally was published in like the late 90s, early 2000s, so there have been some definite updates to that, but it is undeniably written for modern audiences. Part of that is evident in the dialogue itself. In the books, the dialogue is very witty and snappy. That is part of the charm of the series and why people loved it to begin with, and part of what makes it such a successful translation to the screen, because it already has that quickness, that wit to it. Also because in television and movies, dialogue is incredibly important. And so we have these stories that have these historical elements, but are meant for modern audiences. And the way that the production has really interwoven that with the way the series is constructed has been masterful, especially in relation to the music. I think it is amazing. Now look at that in contrast with some of these more recent classics that we've seen picked up. Now granted, I believe the Buccaneers, which we will dive into, like I said, in more depth, has some more modern music in the production. And I kind of understand that in relation to the book I'm reading. But the thing with classics is you are often coming at it with a concept. I'm thinking in relation to, and I know I've mentioned this before if you've been with me for quite a while, so bear with me, but in how we translate things to the stage, if we are doing a Shakespeare for the upteenth time, a director is coming in with a specific concept for that production. There is an angle, a theme that they particularly want to explore. There is a new setting or a new way of approaching the material that they have to come in with to be the reason they're telling that story. And there also has to be the element of why this play, why here, why now? Why are we telling this story now? For something like Bridgerton or modern romance, we have a little bit of this element going back to it being written for modern audiences in some ways. Now granted, TV is a whole different beast and the entertainment of it is part of that why, I am sure. But with these projects like the Buccaneers, like the Persuasion we saw, that was not quite as successful or well received, there is this concept that is being put into it. And it's a concept or an approach that seems tailored or like it will appeal to audiences of Bridgerton, but it's updating the material for a modern audience. If we're thinking about these against something like, let's say, the BBC productions, now while I'm not as well versed in those, they take generally, and correct me if I'm wrong in my perception here, a much more literal approach to the text. Not saying that they don't still imbue that text with emotion, but it's generally a little bit considered more by the book. And to a certain extent, when you already have an iteration that's by the book, you have to come at new versions of something with new approaches. So I have no problems with the classics that are getting produced and the angles and spins that we're seeing on them. I think they're interesting. I think they're fun. I think they're trying to meet modern audiences where they're at. Now, this doesn't always succeed, because we have things like the Persuasion, which I was pretty nice to in my reception of it. I really was trying to see the vision of that concept, but ultimately the concept really fell flat because it seemed at odds with the original source material, the original tone, and audiences felt that. It felt insincere. My radiators have decided right now is the time to start, so apologies for any high whistles that make it through into the final edit. Now, at the same time, we have these classics that are being adapted that are kind of like riding on the wave of this Bridgerton success. It is introducing these works to new audiences, and so I do think it is still a net good. But when we are thinking about all of the series that we were dreaming about seeing on screen and all of the different modern interpretations of that have just never come to fruition, it's kind of sad. And I do think it's more complex than just people judge romance novels. I freely admit that, especially in something like Bridgerton that is so saturated. Yes, we have this idea of things like the Persuasion and the Buccaneers that are coming in wake of this popularity, but they have names like Jane Austen and Edith Wharton behind them that, yes, add some extra credibility, but two, prevent this kind of you're just copying thing, even as we see the germs of these ideas and this visual language that is kind of stemming from Bridgerton to at least my kind of tracking. But if we were to produce something like, say, The Wallflowers by Lisa Kleypas, which was a very popular series mentioned after the popularity of Bridgerton that people would like to see on the screen and directly relates to the subject matter of the Buccaneers, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. I undeniably would love to see that series on screen. As I've said before, there are many series I would love to see on screen. But to the casual viewer, to someone who is not an avid romance reader, because there are people that are fans of the show, you may be one of them, no judgment, that like the show in spite of the romance novels, that don't like romance novels. And to some extent, they may be judging romance novels on the romance novels of the Bridgerton era, because as we've also talked about many times before, romance is a very fast-moving genre, and we've seen a lot of iterations and a lot of growth from romance since Bridgerton, the original series, came out. Now, we've still got a long way to go, we always do, but there has been a lot of change there. So there may be some judgment from the audience itself, again, whether conscious or unconscious, but potentially more importantly, for audiences that, again, aren't avid romance readers, would they see a new series introduced in the same vein as Bridgerton as copying Bridgerton in a way that things like Persuasion and the Buccaneers have this weight and history behind them, so it's not copying, it just enters a similar family? And I don't know the answer to that. In an ideal world for me, all would exist, because I am really intrigued by these productions, and I think, again, in the modern moment, there has to be some kind of concept behind a new production of a classic material. Now, this doesn't have to be extreme. We kind of go back to the infamous 2005 Pride and Prejudice, right? Like, there are still people that absolutely detest that version of the material. There are people that consider it their favorite Pride and Prejudice. I am not here to wade into that argument today. All I'll say is that one of my senior year book reports was a fan edit of Pride and Prejudice 2005 to a Vanessa Carlton song. So there is that way that these new productions, these new visions, introduce new audiences to the material. It breathes new life into the work. And there are arguments that could be made that say that it doesn't trust the audience to meet the material where it's at, but it also provides extra layers, and I'm very excited to dive into the Buccaneers more, to finish the book, to watch the show, and to see especially how the language is handled across the new show, because like I said before, there is that frankness to the dialogue especially that I wasn't anticipating, even as someone who has previously enjoyed everything I've read by Edith Wharton. And so in spite of this, why aren't we seeing more historical romances picked up and adapted? Especially as in general, I feel like we're seeing a kind of uptick, especially in rom-coms. The kind of force of romance and romance readership has really been acknowledged in the mainstream, Bridgerton being a part of that. And I'm also not pretending there aren't outliers, as I know, one, this is a small sample size to begin with. That's why it's just a casual conversation. But we have things like Mr. Malcolm's List, and I don't remember the full production timeline of that, because I know that had been in the works for a long time, but kind of came out at a moment where it kind of dovetailed with Bridgerton and the popularity of Bridgerton. And I think in some ways that they are much different projects. Having talked about that movie on this channel as well, I will again reiterate my confidence that the movie is indeed better than the book. And while you may consider it a reach to look at things like Persuasion and the Buccaneers and tie it directly back to Bridgerton, one, I'm not tying anything definitively and only back to one certain source, as I've said before, but two, if we look at something like Little Women by Greta Gerwig that came out in 2019, right before Bridgerton, right? Notably incredibly well received, including by myself. It made me completely reconsider Amy and my reception of Amy in any way that I have interacted with that material in the past. It also really let me down in that there's that great grand sweeping like camera angle of Joe on the hill. Have I ever talked about this? I don't know. Anyway, for those of you who know, Little Women is also a musical that starred Sutton Foster. And there's a wonderful song in that musical called Astonishing, and I cannot see that shot without thinking of that song, and the fact that the song never comes is really upsetting to me. But other than that, I absolutely adored that movie, and it revitalized as the source material for a lot of people. It had a really interesting point of view and something to say, and it was just so tender and lovely. But we can look at that and the point of view and the concept of that from right before Bridgerton took off and kind of contrast that against what we're getting now. Now, again, none of this lives in a bubble. Nothing lives in a bubble, because you could make an argument that the Buccaneers, at least in how it's being packaged in this trailer so far, so we'll revisit, is pulling on Bridgerton a little bit, but also maybe pulling on Gossip Girl. And you can make an argument, and people have, that Bridgerton is pulling on Gossip Girl. But Gossip Girl is pulling on the society papers that we see in Bridgerton, and notably, I believe, though I have not done the deep dive I truly want to do on this because it's going to be time consuming, is pulling on Edith Wharton. I believe the original books really do trace back to Edith Wharton. So you have all of this that really exist in the same ecosystem. Everything is in conversation, which is why I find it then an interesting conversation to bring here. Because I'm not mad about the new interpretations of the classics that meet new audiences where they are, but I am intrigued by the idea that Bridgerton has been so successful and we haven't seen any other historical romance series picked up in a similar vein. And like I mentioned way back when I first was responding to Bridgerton, and keep in mind, I had been anticipating this series for a long time. Not to be a hipster about it, but when it was originally announced as part of the Shondaland lineup in relation to her deal with Netflix, I was like, wait, Bridgerton? My Bridgerton? And I don't think the wider pop culture landscape was anticipating how many fans already existed. Now, did the production also breathe new life into the series and take interesting conceptual angles? Absolutely. But I would also be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit sad that series like The Wallflowers, or anything by Beverly Jenkins, or the Sarah McLean Extended Universe, or most notably recently, I would love an adaptation of Adriana Herrera's A Caribbean Heiress in Paris series. There are all of these worlds yet to explore, so I don't know that I have an ultimate, point about this. It's just something I wanted to ponder aloud with you all. I would be incredibly interested to know what your thoughts are, if you think these new iterations of classics are coming in wake of the success of Bridgerton, if you think they've been inspired, or that it's just kind of a coincidence that has helped them move into production, if you think they are successful in those conceits, and most importantly, if you would like to see other romance series translated for the screen, and if so, what series? I know I should be grateful that we're getting this influx of romantic comedies again, but as a historical romance lover, I now have this taste of what we could have, and I want to explore all these other worlds I love, even as I recognize that one of the reasons maybe I'm not being able to do that is because the wider public may now see those versions as derivative. But like with a classic that gets revived again and again because it has new angles and new things to say, I think additional romance series have new angles and new things to say, though at the end of the day, maybe I just want to spend some extended time in a gaming hell. So let me know what you're thinking. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to what I have to say, especially as these were a little bit more scattered thoughts. I appreciate you being here. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. It really does help me out, but most importantly, read something good, and yeah, bye.